I'm Stumpy Nubs, and this is my horizontal router. This is actually the second version of this machine. I built one a few years ago to make raised panels using just a regular straight bit instead of one of those fancy raised panel bits. But it turned out to be useful for all sorts of other things. I used it all the time in the shop. The problem is the first version had to be held in a vise during use, which was fine, but I wanted to redesign it to sit on the bench top, and I had some ideas to improve other things. There are two major changes in this version. First, I built a new base for the bottom, and on the back I designed a carriage and lift mechanism to adjust the router's height more easily and accurately. I used drawer slides for the carriage, which I think can be intimidating for some people. The key is to get them properly aligned. I referenced from the center of the slide rather than the edge. That's because the two halves of the drawer slides are different widths. So if I try to measure from the edge of the slide to the edge of the panel, I'm going to have to do math depending on which portion I'm using. It's so much easier to just use the center of those holes as the reference point. And I think on a lot of ball bearing drawer slides, that's 7/8 of an inch. I usually like to make my own router plates because the store-bought ones are just a little pricey. But I found one at Rockler that was reasonable, so I went with that one. And I'm glad I did because it saved me a lot of time and hassle, and it's already set up for throat inserts, which is a big plus. I did have to trim it to make it a little narrower, but that wasn't a problem at all. I needed a way to adjust the position of the carriage in relation to the body of the machine. I could use shims, but I decided to use wood screws as little micro adjusters. That way I can make sure that the plate is perfectly flush to the front of the machine, which is critical. I just have to back the screws out or tighten them in a little bit depending on how much shim I want in there. And when I get it in the right position, I lock the carriage in place over top of the screw heads. It wasn't until after I had this carriage mounted that I realized I needed a way to lock its position when the machine is in use. So I had to take it apart and route a slot down one side. It really wasn't that big of a deal, and by marking the location that I wanted that slot, once I had the carriage assembled and then taking it apart to cut it, I found it was easier to position it correctly. I use hanger bolts a lot in jig making. I think the best way to install them is to just use a wing nut. If you bore your pilot hole the right size, it's not going to be that hard to turn it in. And once I get it screwed all the way in, I just take the wing nut off, add a washer, and put the wing nut right back on. No special tools required. The top panel is another example of why it's better to mark points right on the project rather than trusting the measurements that you have in your plans. The hole has to line up perfectly with its buddy in the carriage beneath, and the best way to do that is to assemble it and then drill both holes together. After that, I took the top panel off so I could embed a nut into it. I used a scrap of threaded rod to help me align the nut over the hole while I traced around it. Then I used a chisel to remove the waste, being sure that the bottom of my mortise was nice and flat. You have to be careful not to get epoxy on the threads inside the nut, so take her easy. You can always gob more epoxy on top of the nut to really lock it in place. I had all of this space beneath the adjustable table that was just going to waste, so I decided to enclose it with a door. It makes for some nice storage for bits and accessories. I'll have it filled with junk in no time. Mounting the table was a little awkward, but not too tricky. I mounted a pair of door hinges on the front of the machine first. Then I clamped the table in place. I got my big head underneath and I marked the center of each screw hole on the bottom of the table. Then I took the table and the hinges back off. That way I could lay it on the bench. I could use those holes I marked to properly align those hinges on the table. And since the holes on the machine itself were already there from having the hinges mounted before, it was easy to put the whole assembly back up, and I knew everything was going to be put together nice and even and aligned. I'm sure there's a better way to do it, but that worked for me. The table's adjuster arms need to be sized and positioned just right so that they don't hit the top of the bench when the table is tilted all the way down. It took a little experimentation to find just the right point to attach them to the side of the machine, but I got it figured out and now I put that in the plans. The tilting table is one of the things that really sets this horizontal routing machine apart from others that I've seen. It really opens up a whole new set of functions. The distance between the router bit and the table is adjusted by raising and lowering the carriage. I epoxied another nut into a wooden crank on top of a lead screw to make it easy to adjust. This is a big improvement over the simple wooden tracking mechanism on my previous version. Another holdover from that first version is the sliding table top. This is designed to lock your workpiece down safely for specific routing tasks. It's especially useful for cutting tenons on the end of rails or for routing small parts. You'll see how that and everything else works in the next video, so stick around.